So the question that's been asked over these last days is, how do we know where we've arrived at when our karma has been burned, our conditioning has been stripped away, and our belief systems erased? And it's been suggested that there are 3 signs. They are that we find ourselves living intensely in the present, so intensely indeed that we lose our sense of self, our sense of separateness, and also that every experience we have is encapsulated, complete in itself, so we have no unfinished business. But let's go a little further to the actual experiences. Let's see if 3 simple old stories will allow us to recognize the experiences that come with this place. The first story is about that sword master, the great samurai teacher, who came to the time when he had to pass his mantle on to a successor. And he had 3 sons, and had to choose between them which one would take over the mastership of his school. So he set up a test for them. He took a curtain and placed it over the doorway to his chamber, and he placed a cushion at the top of the doorway so that if the curtain was disturbed, the cushion would fall. Then he called his first son to him, and his first son pulled the curtain aside, and the cushion fell on his head. He picked it up and placed it back over the doorway before entering the room, and after a short session with his father he was dismissed, and the second son was called. And the second son entered and disturbed the curtain, and the cushion fell. But he was so adroit at his swordsmanship that he had his sword out of its sheath and cut the cushion in 2 before it hit the ground. He entered the chamber and had the session with his father and was then dismissed. And then the third son was called. And this third son, before entering the room, saw the curtain and the cushion, and very carefully took the cushion down, passed through the curtain and the doorway after replacing the cushion where it was above the door. He had his session with his father and was dismissed. It was the third son who was chosen to be the successor and the master of the swordsmanship school. Why? The second story is that story about the prince, whose father, the king, said that he should be trained in the 4 weapons before he would be worthy to take his place as the king. And so he was sent to a far distant place where there was a great master of these weapons, and he stayed with him for some years, learning the art of swordsmanship, learning the mace, learning the way of the bow and arrow. And then at a time, the teacher said to the prince, "You are now ready to return to your father, the king." But the prince said, "What about the 4th weapon? You have not taught me this." And the teacher said, "This weapon you will find in life." Now go on your way." So the prince had to make his way back to his kingdom. But on the way, he found that there was a shortcut that he could take to get him to his kingdom much faster, but it was through a very dense forest. And when he came to the edge of the forest, the woodsmen and others who were there said, "Do not enter this forest. Anyone who enters this forest never returns or never makes their destination." But the king was determined to get home to his palace as soon as he could. So he said, "I am armed with my weapons. I will traverse this forest." So he entered the forest, and it got deeper and deeper and denser and denser. And then suddenly the prince had the sense of something there. And as he looked and peered, he could see a dense and great and threatening force that, as it grew closer to him, appeared demonic. And he looked and thought that even he could see the dripping fangs of a demon-like creature. So he took out his sword and immediately approached this apparition and began to fight with it with his sword. But it seemed that this apparition was made of some substance like tar, and as soon as the tip of his sword touched it, the sword adhered to it and was torn out of his hand. So he took out his mace and he began to swing it around as one does with a mace. But again, the mace adhered to this gooey apparition creature and was pulled out of his hand also. So his only recourse then was to go to his arrows and his bow. So taking out the arrows, he fired them at this thing, but they became like Christmas decorations dangling off the edge of the goo. He was left with no weapons, but the only recourse he had was to fight it by hand. So he threw himself at this creature, but of course he too was clinging to it like it was glue. So he struggled, he writhed in every way that he could to free himself, but unsuccessfully, until suddenly, all of a sudden, the prince realized the fourth weapon, and suddenly he became still and quiet. A few moments passed, and a strange thing happened. The great apparition took the prince and extracted him from itself and placed it in front of it. And it seemed to communicate to the prince, "Why have you stopped struggling? Why are you not fighting me?" And the prince made a reply. What was it that the prince said? to the apparition. The third story is that story also about the prince who decided he wanted to become a master marksman, a master of the bow and arrow. And he went to a great master to seek his tutelage, and after some time he did indeed become a master of archery. So, on his return to his kingdom and his palace, he happened to pass through a village of farms, and he came to a place where there was a row of barns, and on the side of each barn was a place where arrows were shot, a target. And he saw that on each target, in the center of each, was an arrow. And he thought to himself, even I, after all of my training, have never been able to make bullseyes on every shot. I must meet the person who is able to do this. So he alighted from his horse and went to find someone who would introduce him to this super marksman. And he happened to come upon a child, and he asked the child, please, would you direct me to this person who can make a shot in the center of every target successfully? And the child began to laugh at him and said, oh, this is our town fool. You know, he fires the arrow and then he draws the target around it. So, these three stories. Why did the samurai master choose this third son? What is the quality we find ourselves now with? What was it that the prince said to the apparition when asked, why do you no longer fight me? And this third story, what is its meaning? Implying that we have an experience, it's done, and then we draw around it the circle. What is its meaning? What is it that happens for us at the end of every experience, knowing that it's done? But what's the realization that comes from this? What is it that makes us draw the target around the arrow that's been shot and found its mark? What are our experiences of life now? That come with the burning of karma, stripping of conditioning, an erasing of our beliefs. What is it that's there in presence when there's no self, no separateness?
There's no longer a target.
No.
And in the other story, the goal was him, so he didn't have to struggle with it because it was part of him.
That's right. So what did the prince say to this apparition? What is it that we realize with every encounter now? We're no longer a gladiator, no longer in conflict with existence.
I think the prince would have said to the, well, it was the king, wasn't it? The king was saying to the apparition with the tire on it, I think he would have said, you can't fight with something that's not real.
Okay.